She was serving at the train station Café when the billionaire saw his daughter's childhood drawing and he froze. The alarm clock screamed at 5 a.m., same as every morning. Grace Miller's hand shot out from under the thin comforter, slapping the snooze button with the practiced aim of someone who'd done this 1,000 times before. The Seattle rain drummed against the window of her cramped bedroom, barely big enough for a twin bed and a rickety dresser she'd picked up at Goodwill 3 years ago. She could hear Melissa snoring through the paper-thin wall, and somewhere in the apartment, probably the kitchen, Sarah was already brewing coffee. The smell drifted under Grace's door, mixing with the faint scent of mildew that no amount of cleaning could quite eliminate from the old building. 23 years old, and this was her life. Grace dragged herself out of bed, her feet hitting the cold hardwood floor. She'd gotten used to the chill. The landlord was stingy with the heat, and none of them could afford to complain. Not when rent in Seattle kept climbing and jobs that paid decent money were harder to find than sunshine in November. By 5:45, she was showered, dressed in her standard black pants and white button-down, her dark hair pulled back in a neat ponytail. The face staring back at her from the bathroom mirror looked tired. There was something in her brown eyes, a sadness she'd carried for as long as she could remember. Sister Margaret used to tell her she had old eyes that had seen more than a young girl should have to see. But what had she really seen? Nothing. Just the inside of St. Anne's orphanage until she aged out at 18. Then a series of dead-end jobs in shared apartments with strangers who became friends out of necessity rather than choice. The bus ride to downtown Seattle took 40 minutes, packed with other early morning workers heading to clean offices, serve food, or stock shelves before the city's wealthier inhabitants rolled out of bed. Grace pressed her forehead against the window, watching the city transform from her neighborhood's worn buildings to the gleaming high-rises of the business district. By 6:45, she was pushing through the heavy glass door of the Riverside Café. "Morning, Grace," Danny called from behind the espresso machine, already pulling shots for the first wave of commuters. "Morning," she managed a smile, tying her apron around her waist. The café smelled like it always did. Rich coffee, butter from the pastries warming in the display case, and underneath it all, the metallic scent of the trains that thundered past every few minutes on the tracks just outside. The Riverside Café sat right in the heart of Seattle's main train station, a constant chaos of arriving and departing passengers. People rushed through with their rolling suitcases and their eyes glued to their phones, barely registering the servers who kept them caffeinated and fed. Grace had worked here for 3 years, and she could count on one hand the number of customers who'd actually looked at her face long enough to remember it. That was fine. She preferred being invisible most days. The morning rush hit like a tidal wave. Grace moved on autopilot, taking orders, delivering steaming mugs, clearing tables, smiling mechanically at people who never smiled back. Her hands, calloused from years of this work, handled hot plates without flinching. During a brief lull around 9:30, she let herself glance at the drawing hanging on the wall behind the counter. She'd put it there when she first started working at the café, and Marco, the owner, had been kind enough to let it stay. It was nothing special, just a child's crayon drawing on construction paper, now faded and slightly curled at the edges despite the simple black frame. A house with a triangle roof, a tree with a brown trunk and green circles for leaves, 2 stick figures holding hands, one tall, one small, and underneath, in the careful block letters of a 5-year-old, "Dad and me, Grace." She'd drawn it at St. Anne's during art time, pouring all her little girl dreams onto that paper. Sister Margaret had kept it safe all those years, then given it to her when Grace left the orphanage. "So you never forget to hope," the old nun had said, pressing the frame into Grace's hands. Hope. Grace touched the silver bracelet at her neck, the one with that very word engraved on it. It was the only thing that had been with her when Sister Margaret found her abandoned on the orphanage doorstep 23 years ago. Just a baby, wrapped in a thin blanket, with this bracelet and a fake birth certificate. Grace Miller. That's what the certificate said, though Sister Margaret always suspected it wasn't her real name, but it was the only name she had, so it became hers. "Grace, Table 6 needs their check." Danny's voice snapped her back to reality. "On it." The cafe was filling up again with the mid-morning crowd. Grace grabbed the check and headed to Table 6, weaving between chairs and scattered luggage. That's when the door opened. and he walked in. Grace noticed him immediately, which was unusual. He was older, maybe early 50s, wearing an expensive-looking charcoal suit that screamed money. His dark hair was silvered at the temples, and there was something heavy in the way he carried himself, like a man who'd been bent under an invisible weight for too long. He stood in the doorway for a moment, scanning the cafe, then made his way to a corner table near the window. Grace finished with table 6 and grabbed a menu, approaching him. "Good morning. What can I get you started with?" He looked up, and everything stopped. The man's face went absolutely white. His eyes, a striking blue-gray, went wide, and his mouth opened slightly, no words coming out. He stared at Grace like he was seeing a ghost. "Sir," Grace shifted uncomfortably. "Are you okay?" His voice came out hoarse. "I'm sorry. Your face." Now other customers were starting to look. Grace felt heat rising in her cheeks. "Do you need a minute?" But he wasn't looking at her anymore. His eyes had moved past her shoulder, focusing on something behind the counter. Grace turned to follow his gaze. The drawing. He was staring at her childhood drawing. When she turned back, he was standing, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "That drawing," he said, his voice shaking. "Where did you get that drawing?" I made it when I was 5. Why? And that bracelet." He pointed at her neck with a trembling hand. Please, let me see it." Grace's hand instinctively went to the silver chain. "I don't understand. Please." There were tears in his eyes now. "Just let me see it." Something in his desperation made her comply. With shaking fingers, Grace unclasped the bracelet and held it out. The man took it like it was made of glass. Bringing it close to his face, his thumb traced the engraved word, hope, then stopped at the letter H. He made a sound, something between a sob and a gasp. "It's you," he whispered. "Oh my God, it's really you." Then Thomas Davenport, one of the most powerful men in America, fell to his knees in the middle of the Riverside Café and wept. "I'm your father," he said through his tears, "and I've been looking for you for 23 years. 23 years earlier, the delivery room at St. Andrew's Hospital was chaos. Urgent voices, the steady beep of monitors, nurses moving with practiced efficiency around the bed where Laura Davenport lay fighting for her life. "We're losing her," someone shouted. Thomas stood frozen against the wall, a security guard's hand on his shoulder keeping him out of the way. His wife's face was pale as death, her dark hair plastered to her forehead with sweat. She'd been in labor for 18 hours, and something had gone terribly wrong. "The baby's in distress. We need to do an emergency C-section now." Everything became a blur of movement. More doctors rushed in. Someone was cutting Laura's hospital gown. Thomas tried to get closer, but firm hands held him back. "Mr. Davenport, you need to wait outside." "That's my wife." "Sir, please, let us do our jobs." He found himself in the hallway, pacing, praying to a God he wasn't sure he believed in. Through the small window in the door, he could see the medical team working frantically. The minutes crawled by like hours. Then, a sound, a baby's cry, thin and sharp. The door burst open. A nurse, her scrubs splattered with blood, held a tiny bundle wrapped in a pink blanket. "Mr. Davenport, you have a daughter." Thomas reached for her with shaking hands. The baby was so small, with a wrinkled red face and a surprising amount of dark hair. She'd stopped crying and was looking up at him with enormous eyes. Laura's eyes. "She's perfect," he whispered. "We need to take her to the nursery for evaluation," the nurse said gently. "But she appears healthy. And my wife." The nurse's face told him everything before her words did. "I'm sorry. She lost too much blood. The doctors did everything they could." The world tilted. Thomas might have fallen if someone hadn't caught his arm. Laura was gone. His Laura, who'd spent months picking out baby clothes and painting the nursery lavender, who'd rubbed her belly and talked to their daughter every night, making up stories about the life they'd have together. Gone. "Sir," the nurse's voice seemed to come from far away. "We need to take the baby now." In a daze, Thomas removed the thin gold chain from around his neck, a gift from Laura on their first anniversary. He'd been keeping it safe for her during the delivery. Attached to it was a small silver charm, a custom piece Laura had commissioned, a tiny oval with the word hope engraved on it. The jeweler had made a mistake on the letter H, accidentally adding an extra curve that made it look like a small heart. Laura had loved the mistake and refused to have it fixed. "For our daughter," she'd said, placing her hand over her swollen belly, "so she'll always have hope." With trembling fingers, Thomas fastened the delicate bracelet around his newborn daughter's tiny wrist. It was far too big, hanging loose, but it was all he had left of Laura to give. "Take care of her," he whispered to the nurse. He never saw his daughter again. Victoria Lang stood in the staff break room on the 3rd floor, West Wing, watching through the window as the drama unfolded below. She'd been working the night shift in the maternity ward for 3 years, and she knew what a code blue meant. When word spread that Laura Davenport had died and left behind a healthy baby girl, Victoria's mind started working. She'd seen Thomas Davenport before. Everyone had. The construction billionaire had donated a whole wing to St. Andrews 2 years ago. His face was on the wall in the lobby, shaking hands with the hospital administrator. Money like that didn't come around often, and now he was a widower with a newborn. Victoria studied her reflection in the break room's small mirror. She was 30 years old, attractive enough, but stuck in a dead-end nursing job with student loans that would take decades to pay off. She'd watched wealthy patients come through these halls her entire career, imagining what it would be like to live in their world. This was her chance. She could feel it, but there was a problem. The baby. As long as Thomas Davenport had his daughter, he'd be tied forever to the memory of his dead wife. He'd pour all his love and attention into that child, and there'd be no room for anyone else. The idea came to her fully formed, as if it had been waiting in the shadows of her mind for just this moment. She found Carol Vickers in the nursery, checking on the newborns. Carol was the head nurse, 15 years older than Victoria, and everyone knew she had a gambling problem. The rumor mill said she was deep in debt to some very unpleasant people. "Carol," Victoria said quietly, glancing around to make sure they were alone, "I need to talk to you about something that could solve both our problems." 2 hours later, at exactly 2:47 a.m., Carol Vickers carried a baby girl out of the nursery through the West Wing service entrance. Her uniform, light blue scrubs with white stripes on the sleeves, blended perfectly with the shadows. The security cameras on that corridor had mysteriously malfunctioned earlier in the evening. Victoria was waiting by her car in the staff parking lot. She didn't look at the bundle in Carol's arms. Couldn't. If she saw the baby's face, she might lose her nerve. 50,000, Carol said, her voice hard. "That's what you promised. You'll have it by the end of the week." Victoria had been saving for years, and she had another 20,000 in credit card advances. It would nearly bankrupt her, but it was an investment. "You know what you have to do. Alter the records, wipe the footage, spread the right rumors." Carol shifted the baby in her arms. The infant was sleeping, making small snuffling sounds. What about her? St. Anne's orphanage, 50 miles out in the poor district. Leave her at the door. Someone will find her. And if they don't, they will. It's an orphanage run by nuns. They check the entrance constantly for abandoned babies. Carol nodded slowly. "This is it then. After tonight, we never speak about this again. We never speak again. Period. As far as anyone's concerned, we barely know each other." Victoria watched Carol's taillights disappear into the rain, then sat in her car for a long time, hands gripping the steering wheel. She'd just crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, but when she thought about Thomas Davenport's face, about the life she could have as his wife, the guilt faded. She'd done what she had to do. She'd eliminated an obstacle, 50 miles away. Sister Margaret was making her rounds before morning prayers when she heard it. A baby's cry, thin and desperate, coming from the front steps. She moved faster than her 70-year-old joints usually allowed. Throwing open the heavy wooden door, there, in a worn blanket, was an infant girl, maybe a few hours old, with a shock of dark hair and a silver bracelet hanging loose on her tiny wrist. "Sweet Lord," Sister Margaret whispered, scooping up the baby and hurrying inside. Who would do such a thing? Tucked into the blanket was an envelope. Inside, a birth certificate, Grace Miller, born that very date. Parents unknown. Sister Margaret looked at the bracelet. Hope. Such a strange thing to leave with an abandoned child. But perhaps not so strange after all. Perhaps whoever left this baby here wanted her to have something precious. wanted her to remember that hope exists, even in the darkest moments. The baby girl stopped crying when Sister Margaret held her close, her tiny fingers wrapping around the nun's thumb with surprising strength. "Grace," Sister Margaret said softly. "We'll call you Grace, and I promise you, little one, you'll always have hope here." Present-day Grace stood in the middle of the cafe, the world spinning around her. Thomas Davenport, she'd heard that name before, seen it on buildings around the city, was still on his knees, tears streaming down his face, holding her bracelet like it was the most precious thing in existence. "I don't understand," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Other customers were staring now, some with phones out. "What are you talking about?" Thomas looked up at her, and Grace felt something shift deep in her chest. There was something in his eyes, grief, hope, desperate love, that felt ancient and familiar all at once. "My wife Laura died giving birth to our daughter 23 years ago," he said, his words tumbling out. "Hours later, my baby girl disappeared from the hospital, just vanished. They told me she was probably taken by traffickers, that I'd never see her again." He held up the bracelet. "This was custom made. There's a flaw in the H. See how it looks like a heart? The jeweler messed up. But Laura loved it. She said it made it unique, one of a kind. I put this on my daughter's wrist myself, 2 hours after she was born." Grace's hand went to her throat, to the phantom weight of the bracelet that had hung there for as long as she could remember. "And your face," Thomas continued, standing now, moving closer. "You look exactly like her, like Laura. The same eyes, the same—" His voice broke. "I've spent 23 years searching. Private investigators, rewards, everything. I never stopped looking, and now here you are with her bracelet, with her face, with a drawing that says—" He glanced back at the childish artwork on the wall. "Dad and me. This is insane," Grace said. But even as she said it, something was clicking into place. The orphanage, the fake birth certificate, Sister Margaret's certainty that Grace's real name was something else. "Will you take a DNA test?" Thomas asked. "Please, I need to know for sure." Grace looked at this stranger, this wealthy, powerful stranger who claimed to be her father. Every instinct told her to run, to protect herself from the inevitable disappointment, but something stronger than instinct made her nod. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll take the test." Victoria Davenport stood in front of the full-length mirror in her dressing room, fastening a strand of pearls around her neck. Real ones, purchased at Tiffany's with Thomas's black card. Everything about her life now was real. Real silk, real diamonds, real power. The mansion stretched around her like a testament to her success. 5 bedrooms, 7 bathrooms, a kitchen bigger than most apartments, and grounds that required a full-time gardener. She'd come a long way from that cramped studio apartment she'd rented on a nurse's salary all those years ago. 20 years of marriage to Thomas Davenport. And she'd played her role flawlessly. She adjusted the pearls, studying her reflection with a critical eye. At 52, she could still turn heads. Regular Botox, a personal trainer, and a stylist who knew exactly how to dress her made sure of that. She looked like what she was, the wife of a billionaire, polished and perfect. "Mrs. Davenport," the housekeeper's voice came from the doorway. "Mr. Davenport called. He said he'll be late tonight, something came up." "Thank you, Maria." Something came up. That was the 3rd time this week. Thomas had changed his plans without explanation. Victoria's perfectly manicured fingers tightened on her lipstick. Something was wrong. 21 years earlier, Victoria had waited exactly 2 years after the baby disappeared before making her move. 2 years of watching Thomas Davenport spiral into depression. 2 years of careful planning and preparation. She'd quit her nursing job a week after that night, telling everyone she was moving to California to be closer to family. Instead, she'd stayed in Seattle. Using a different name, taking courses in business etiquette and psychology, she read books on art, wine, classical music, everything the wealthy talked about at their dinner parties. She'd changed her hair, her style, even her speaking patterns. Victoria Lang, the struggling nurse with student debt and a rough edge, disappeared. In her place emerged Victoria Lane, cultured and sophisticated, with a carefully constructed background as an occupational therapist, when she accidentally ran into Thomas at a charity gala 2 years later. He didn't recognize her. Why would he? They'd never actually met at the hospital. She'd made sure of that. She'd been just another face in scrubs, forgettable and anonymous. "I don't usually come to these things," she'd said, champagne glass in hand. Every word rehearsed. "But my practice donated to the children's wing, so I felt obligated." Thomas had looked hollow, like a man going through the motions of living. "I know the feeling. I built half this hospital, but I'd rather be anywhere else." "Thomas Davenport," she'd said, extending her hand. "I've read about you. I'm so sorry about your wife." Most people avoided mentioning Laura. Their pity made Thomas uncomfortable. But Victoria had done her research. She knew he wanted to talk about her, needed to talk about her. "Thank you," he'd said, and something in his face had softened. Most people pretend it never happened. That was the beginning. A friendship first, carefully cultivated. She'd let him talk about Laura for hours, never showing jealousy, always offering understanding. She'd learned everything about his dead wife, her favorite flowers, her laugh, the way she'd organized Thomas's chaotic schedule. Victoria became indispensable slowly, like a vine growing around a tree. She was there when he had bad days. She listened when he needed to talk. She never pushed, never demanded. She just existed in his orbit, warm and steady and safe. 3 years after their first meeting, Thomas proposed. Victoria had cried, real tears this time, and said yes, she'd won. Present day. Victoria's phone buzzed with a text from Diane, one of her society friends. Saw the news. Is it true? Thomas found his daughter. Ice flooded Victoria's veins. She read the message 3 times, her heart hammering. No, this wasn't possible. Her fingers flew across the screen, pulling up news sites. There it was, trending on every local outlet. Billionaire Thomas Davenport reunited with long-lost daughter Grace Miller, 23-year-old Café waitress, maybe missing heiress DNA test pending in shocking case of hospital disappearance. There was a photo, grainy, taken by someone's phone camera. Thomas kneeling in what looked like a coffee shop, and standing over him, a young woman with dark hair and Laura's face. Laura's face. Victoria's phone slipped from her fingers, clattering on the marble vanity. This couldn't be happening. The baby was supposed to disappear. She was supposed to grow up anonymous, adopted by some family in another state, completely untraceable. That was the plan. How had Thomas found her? How had she ended up in Seattle? Of all places. Victoria's mind raced through possibilities and contingencies. Carol was dead. She'd made sure to check on that years ago. The woman had drunk herself to death 5 years after their arrangement, taking their secret to the grave. The hospital records had been thoroughly scrubbed. There was no trail leading back to her. But if DNA proved this girl was really Thomas's daughter, Victoria forced herself to breathe slowly. She hadn't survived this long by panicking. She was smarter than this. She just needed to think. There were ways to handle this. There were always ways. She picked up her phone and made a call. "Robert, it's Victoria Davenport. I need to meet with you tonight. It's urgent." Robert Chen was the best attorney in Seattle. Expensive, discreet, and willing to work in the gray areas of the law when necessary. If anyone could help her navigate this nightmare, it was him. Thomas came home just after midnight. Victoria was waiting in the living room, a glass of wine in hand, perfectly composed. "You're up late," he said, loosening his tie. There was something different about him, an energy, a lightness she hadn't seen in years. "I saw the news." Victoria kept her voice carefully neutral. "Is it true?" Thomas's face transformed, and Victoria felt a stab of something dark and ugly in her chest. He looked happy, actually. Genuinely happy, in a way he'd never looked at her. "We won't know for sure until the DNA results come back," he said, sitting down across from her. "But Victoria, I saw the bracelet, the one Laura had made, with the flaw in the H. It's identical. And her face, she looks exactly like Laura did at that age. That's incredible." Victoria forced enthusiasm into her voice. "After all these years, where did you find her?" "I didn't find her. We found each other. Complete accident. I stopped for coffee at a train station cafe, and there she was." Thomas leaned forward, hands clasped. "Her name is Grace. She grew up in an orphanage here in Seattle. She was abandoned as a baby with a fake birth certificate. An orphanage here. Victoria felt sweat prickling at her hairline, despite the mansion's perfect climate control. That's quite a coincidence. The police said at the time that traffickers probably took her out of state. But what if she never left Seattle at all? What if someone just left her somewhere thinking she'd be found and cared for? Victoria took a careful sip of wine. It's wonderful that you found her, Thomas, truly. But you have to be careful. There are people who might try to take advantage. She's not like that. His tone was sharp, defensive. I can tell there's something about her. She has Laura's kindness, her gentleness. Of course. I just meant that you should protect yourself. Protect both of you. DNA tests can be faked. Records can be. The test is being handled by the best lab in the country. I made sure of it. Thomas stood, and Victoria could see the conversation was over. I'm tired. I'm going to bed. He left without kissing her goodnight. Victoria sat alone in the vast living room, surrounded by expensive furniture and original artwork, and felt the first real tremor of fear. 3 weeks of agony followed. 3 weeks of watching Thomas disappear for hours to meet with this girl. This Grace. 3 weeks of carefully worded texts and phone calls. Victoria trying to gauge just how much danger she was in. She met with Robert Chen twice, discussing options. If the DNA comes back positive, there's not much we can do legally, he'd said. She'd be his legitimate heir, but we could challenge her character, suggest she somehow manipulated the situation, plant seeds of doubt. Whatever it takes, Victoria had told him. I don't care what it costs. She thought about running. She had money in offshore accounts that Thomas didn't know about. A passport under her maiden name. She could disappear to Europe, start over somewhere new. But she'd worked too hard for this life to give it up without a fight. The day the DNA results came back, Thomas called her from his office downtown. It's confirmed, he said, and she could hear tears in his voice. She's my daughter. Grace is my daughter. Victoria closed her eyes, standing in her perfect kitchen with its marble countertops and professional-grade appliances. That's wonderful news, she said, each word like swallowing glass. I'm so happy for you. I want you to meet her tomorrow. Can we have dinner here at the house? Of course, I'd love to meet her. After she hung up, Victoria stood very still for a long moment. Then she walked to the study, locked the door, and began making plans. She'd eliminated one obstacle 23 years ago. She could eliminate another one now. Grace stood outside the Davenport mansion, her hands shaking so badly she had to clasp them together. The iron gates had opened automatically when Thomas's car approached. And now they were pulling up a circular driveway that probably cost more than every place she'd ever lived combined. You okay? Thomas glanced at her from the driver's seat. Over the past 3 weeks, they'd met for coffee a dozen times, talking for hours, trying to bridge 23 years of absence. But this, coming to his home, meeting his wife, felt different, more real, more permanent. Just nervous, Grace admitted. She was wearing the nicest outfit she owned, a simple navy dress from Target that suddenly felt incredibly cheap. I don't really belong in places like this. Yes, you do, Thomas said firmly. This is your home too now, if you want it to be. The mansion loomed in front of them, all stone and glass and perfectly manicured landscaping. Grace had seen houses like this in movies, but being here in person made her stomach twist with anxiety. Victoria was waiting at the front door. Grace's first thought was that Thomas's wife was beautiful, the kind of polished, expensive beauty that came from professional stylists and personal trainers. She wore cream-colored slacks and a silk blouse, pearls at her throat, her blonde hair swept back in an elegant chignon. Everything about her screamed money and class. You must be Grace. Victoria's smile was perfect. Not too warm, but not cold either. I've heard so much about you, please come in. The interior of the mansion was even more intimidating. High ceilings, crystal chandeliers, furniture that looked like it belonged in a museum. Grace's sneakers squeaked slightly on the marble floor, and she wanted to disappear. Maria has prepared dinner, Victoria said, leading them toward what Grace assumed was the dining room. I hope you like salmon. Thomas mentioned you weren't vegetarian. Salmon's great, thank you. Grace's voice sounded small in the vast space. The dining room table could have seated 20 people easily. 3 places were set at one end. Thomas at the head, Victoria to his right, and a spot for Grace to his left. The china looked ancient, and probably cost more than Grace made in a year. A woman in a uniform, Maria, Grace assumed, brought out the first course, some kind of soup with herbs floating in it. Grace watched Victoria pick up the spoon farthest from her plate and followed suit, terrified of using the wrong utensil. "So, Grace," Victoria said, dabbing her mouth with a linen napkin. "Thomas tells me you've been working at a cafe. That must be interesting work." There was something in the way she said interesting that made Grace's cheeks burn. "It pays the bills, most of the time anyway. I'm sure it's been difficult, growing up without family support." Victoria's tone was sympathetic, but her eyes were assessing, cataloging every flaw. "An orphanage," Thomas said. "St. Anne's. The nuns were good to me, especially Sister Margaret. How fortunate that you had someone." Victoria took a sip of wine. "And now here you are, in such different circumstances. It must be quite overwhelming." "It is," Grace admitted. She could feel herself being evaluated, found wanting, every time she reached for the wrong fork, or didn't know which glass was for water versus wine. She caught a flicker of something in Victoria's expression, not quite contempt, but close. Thomas seemed oblivious to the undercurrent, chatting happily about his plans to help Grace enroll in college. "You mentioned wanting to study nursing," he said. "We could get you into any program you want. University of Washington has an excellent program." "I appreciate that, but I need to work. I have rent, and—" "You don't need to worry about that anymore," Thomas said. "I want to help you. I've missed 23 years. Let me make up for some of it." Grace felt Victoria's eyes on her, sharp and cold despite the smile on her face. "That's very generous of your father," Victoria said. "I'm sure Grace wouldn't want to take advantage of such kindness, though. Would you?" "Dear." The word dear felt like a slap. Grace set down her fork, suddenly not hungry. "I don't want to take advantage of anyone. Maybe this was a mistake." "No." Thomas reached across and covered her hand with his. "This isn't a mistake. You're my daughter. I want you in my life." The rest of the dinner was excruciating. Victoria made subtle digs disguised as concern. Questions about Grace's education, her job history, her plans for the future, all designed to highlight how different their worlds were. By the time dessert came, Grace wanted to run. "I should probably head home," she said as soon as was polite. "Early shift tomorrow." Thomas looked disappointed, but didn't argue. "I'll drive you." "Actually," Victoria said smoothly, "I was hoping Grace and I could have a few minutes alone." "Girl talk, you understand?" Grace's stomach dropped, but Thomas smiled. "That's a great idea. I'll be in my study." Once he left, Victoria's smile disappeared like a mask being removed. "Let's not pretend we're friends," she said, refilling her wine glass. "You seem like a nice enough girl, but let's be honest about what's happening here. You show up out of nowhere with a convenient story, and suddenly you're the long-lost daughter. It's quite a coincidence. The DNA test. Tests can be manipulated, especially when someone stands to inherit billions." Victoria leaned back in her chair, studying Grace. "I've been with Thomas for 20 years. I helped him through the worst time of his life, and now you waltz in and expect what? To take my place?" "I don't want to take anything from you," Grace said, her voice shaking. "I didn't ask for any of this." "Then leave. Walk away. Let Thomas remember his lost daughter as a beautiful dream instead of dealing with the reality of—" Victoria gestured at Grace. "Whatever this is." Grace stood, her chair scraping loudly. "I'm not going anywhere. Thomas is my father. The DNA proved it. And if that bothers you, that's your problem, not mine." She grabbed her purse and walked out, finding Thomas in his study. "I need to go now." He drove her home in confused silence. When they pulled up outside her apartment building, Grace turned to him. "Your wife hates me." Thomas sighed. "She's just adjusting. This is a big change for everyone. She thinks I'm a con artist. She's protective. Give her time." But Grace had seen the cold calculation in Victoria's eyes. This wasn't about time. This was about war. The next morning, Grace took the bus to St. Anne's. She needed to see Sister Margaret, needed the grounding presence of the woman who'd raised her. The orphanage looked smaller than she remembered, the paint peeling more, the playground equipment rustier. But when Sister Margaret opened the door, her weathered face breaking into a huge smile, Grace felt something in her chest unclench. "Grace, I saw the news. Come here, child." Sister Margaret's hug was fierce and warm and smelled like lavender soap. Grace burst into tears. "I don't know what to do," she sobbed. "Everything's happening so fast. Thomas wants me to move into the mansion, go to college, be part of his world, but his wife hates me, and I feel like I'm betraying you, and I don't fit in anywhere." "Shh. Slow down." Sister Margaret led her to a worn couch in the small office. "Tell me everything." Grace poured it all out. The DNA test, the mansion, Victoria's hostility, her own confusion about where she belonged. When she finished, Sister Margaret was quiet for a long moment. "Do you believe Thomas is truly your father?" "Yes, I feel it, and the DNA." "Then you have a choice to make. You can let fear and insecurity keep you in the life you know, safe but limited, or you can step into this new life, even though it's scary and uncertain." Sister Margaret took Grace's hands. "I've always known you were special, that bracelet, the way you were left. Someone wanted you found. Someone wanted you to have hope. But what about you, this place? Child, you're not betraying me by accepting your father's love. I'll always be here. This will always be home if you need it. But you deserve to know your real family. You deserve to have every opportunity that was stolen from you." Grace hugged her again, tears still flowing. "I'm so scared. I know, but you're also brave. You've survived this long. You'll survive this too." That night, Grace's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "This is Victoria. We need to talk. Coffee tomorrow, just us." Grace stared at the message for a long time before responding. "Okay, where?" The response came immediately. "Riverside Café, 2 p.m. I think it's time we understood each other." Grace set down her phone, her hands shaking. She had no idea what Victoria wanted, but she knew one thing for certain. This was just the beginning of a much larger battle, and she wasn't sure she knew how to fight. Victoria arrived at the Riverside Café exactly on time, dressed down in designer jeans and a cashmere sweater that probably cost more than Grace's monthly rent. She ordered a latte and chose a corner table, away from the curious eyes of other customers. Grace finished her shift at 2 and untied her apron with shaking hands. Danny gave her a concerned look as she passed the counter. "You sure you're okay? That lady's been staring at you for 20 minutes. "I'm fine, just personal stuff." Victoria's smile was thin as Grace sat down across from her. "Thank you for meeting me. I thought it was time we had an honest conversation." "Okay." Grace kept her voice steady. "I'm listening. I want you to understand something, Grace. I'm not your enemy. I'm simply being realistic." Victoria stirred her latte slowly. "You and Thomas share DNA, yes. But do you really think that's enough? You're from completely different worlds. You have nothing in common except biology. We're getting to know each other. He's infatuated with the idea of you. The fantasy of the lost daughter returned. But reality is different. Eventually, he'll see that you don't fit into his life. That you can't." Victoria leaned forward. "I'm trying to save you from that heartbreak. And save Thomas from the disappointment." Grace felt anger rising in her chest. "You don't get to decide what Thomas feels. I've been his wife for 20 years. I know him better than anyone. And I know that once the novelty wears off, he'll realize that blood isn't enough." Victoria's eyes were cold. "Walk away now, Grace. Take a settlement. I can make sure you're comfortable for life. But leave before this gets messy. No, you're making a mistake. Maybe. But it's my mistake to make." Victoria's expression hardened. "Then understand this. I will protect what's mine. By any means necessary." She stood, leaving her barely touched latte on the table. "You've been warned." After she left, Grace sat there for a long time, her hands trembling. Danny brought her a cup of tea without being asked. "That looked intense," he said quietly. "She wants me gone. What are you going to do?" Grace thought about Sister Margaret's words, about bravery and survival. "I'm going to fight." Over the next 2 weeks, Victoria's campaign against Grace was subtle but relentless. She couldn't attack openly. Thomas would never forgive that. So instead, she worked in shadows. At a charity gala, Thomas insisted Grace attend. Victoria introduced her to Seattle's elite with just the right tone of condescension. "This is Grace, Thomas's daughter. She's been working in food service. Isn't that interesting?" The implication was clear. Grace was beneath them. An embarrassment. Grace wore a dress Thomas had bought for her, but she felt like a fraud. She didn't know which fork to use during the 7-course dinner. She didn't understand the inside jokes about summer homes in the Hamptons or winter ski trips to Aspen. Every conversation felt like a test. She was failing. Victoria watched it all with a satisfied smile. But worse than the public humiliation was what happened behind the scenes. Grace started hearing rumors, whispers that she was after Thomas's money, that the DNA test might have been tampered with, that she had a history of scamming wealthy men. None of it was true, but the damage was done. Thomas's business associates became distant. His friends stopped calling. The press, which had initially treated Grace's story as a heartwarming miracle, began publishing more skeptical pieces. Sources close to the family suggest Grace Miller may not be who she claims. Financial experts question the timing of the alleged daughter's appearance. Thomas Davenport's judgment called into question as daughter controversy grows. Thomas tried to shield Grace from it, but she saw how it wore on him. Lines appeared around his eyes. He stopped sleeping well. His company's stock dipped as investors grew nervous about his stability. And through it all, Victoria played the perfect wife. Supportive in public, sympathetic about the difficult situation, always ready with a subtle reminder that things were simpler before Grace appeared. Grace felt like she was drowning. She started having panic attacks in the middle of the night, gasping awake with her heart racing. The apartment she shared with Melissa and Sarah felt simultaneously too small and too far from where she needed to be. She didn't belong there anymore, but she didn't belong in Thomas's world either. She was caught between two lives, fitting into neither. "Maybe Victoria's right," she told Sister Margaret during one of her visits to St. Anne's. "Maybe I should just take whatever settlement she's offering and disappear. Thomas would be better off without me, his company, his reputation." "Stop." Sister Margaret's voice was sharp. "That woman is manipulating you, can't you see it? I see that everything's falling apart. Because she's making it fall apart." Sister Margaret gripped Grace's shoulders. "She's threatened by you. Why would she go to such lengths if you weren't a real danger to whatever she's built?" Grace hadn't thought of it that way. "You think she's scared of me. I think she's terrified. And desperate people do desperate things." That night, Grace made a decision. If Victoria wanted to play dirty, Grace needed to understand what she was really dealing with. She needed to know who Victoria really was. She started digging. It wasn't easy. Victoria's background seemed solid. Credentials as an occupational therapist, references from clinics she'd supposedly worked at, a paper trail that all checked out. But something about it felt too perfect, too carefully constructed. Grace spent hours in the Seattle Public Library, going through old newspapers and public records. She taught herself how to search property records, business registrations, anything that might give her a clue. She found Victoria's marriage certificate to Thomas, 20 years ago, just like Victoria said. But when Grace tried to trace Victoria's life before that, things got fuzzy. The clinics Victoria claimed to have worked at had closed. Her references were all dead or untraceable. Her college transcripts seemed legitimate, but when Grace called the university, they had no record of a Victoria Lane in their occupational therapy program. It was as if Victoria Lane hadn't existed before she met Thomas. Grace's hands shook as she realized what that might mean. People only erased their pasts when they had something to hide. Meanwhile, Thomas was pulling away from Victoria in ways he didn't fully understand himself. Small things at first. Coming to bed later, spending more time at the office, finding excuses not to attend social events where Victoria would be at his side. He found himself comparing his wife to Laura more than he had in years. Laura had been genuine, warm, unpolished in the best way. Victoria was always performing, always calculating. How had he never noticed that before? But every time doubt crept in, Victoria was there with a perfectly timed gesture, his favorite meal, a thoughtful gift, a concerned touch on his arm. "I know this is hard on you," she'd say. "I'm here for you, whatever you need." It should have been comforting. Instead, it felt suffocating. One evening, Thomas found himself in his study, looking at old photos of Laura. Most were professional. wedding photos, vacation shots, carefully staged memories. Victoria had offered to help him organize them years ago, and now they were all neatly filed away in albums. But there had been others. Casual snapshots, silly selfies, candid moments. Where were those? He spent 2 hours searching before admitting they were gone. Disappeared. When he asked Victoria about it, she looked confused. "Darling, I think you're misremembering. These are all the photos you had, remember? We went through everything together years ago, but Thomas was certain there had been more. A whole box of them." Where had they gone? Grace and Thomas started meeting for lunch regularly, away from the mansion and Victoria's watchful eyes. They'd go to small restaurants where nobody recognized them, and talk for hours. Thomas told her about Laura. Really told her. Sharing memories he'd kept locked away. Grace told him about growing up at St. Anne's, about Sister Margaret, about her dreams of becoming a nurse. "You're so much like her," Thomas said one afternoon, watching Grace laugh at something the waitress said. "Not just your face, your kindness, the way you see people. I wish I could have known her. She would have loved you so much." Thomas's eyes were wet. She was so excited to be a mom. We had the nursery already, painted lavender with clouds on the ceiling. She'd spent weeks getting everything perfect. What happened to it? The nursery? Thomas looked away. Victoria had it remodeled. Said keeping it as a shrine was unhealthy. She was probably right, but his voice caught. "I wish I'd kept something. Anything." Grace reached across the table and took his hand. "You have me now. I'm something. You're everything." It was the first time Grace truly believed she belonged in his life. Not because of DNA or legal documents, but because they needed each other. And Victoria, watching from her carefully constructed tower of lies, realized she was losing, which meant it was time to escalate. Robert Chen called Victoria late one night with news. "I found someone. Carol Vickers. She worked at St. Andrew's Hospital the night Thomas's baby disappeared." Victoria's blood turned to ice. "Carol's dead. I checked years ago. She's very much alive. In a nursing home out in Tacoma, advanced cirrhosis. Not much time left, but she's coherent enough to talk. Then make sure she doesn't talk. I don't care what it costs. Victoria, we need to be smart about this." "I said handle it." She hung up, her heart racing. This was spiraling out of control faster than she could contain it. Carol was supposed to be gone. Dead. Silent forever. If she talked, Victoria looked around at her beautiful home. Her perfect life. Everything she'd built on a foundation of lies and stolen innocence. She couldn't let it crumble. She wouldn't, whatever it took. The argument started over something trivial. Thomas mentioning that Grace would be joining them for Thanksgiving dinner. "Of course she's welcome," Victoria said, her voice tight as she arranged flowers in the dining room. "Though I'd already finalized the guest list with the caterers. Senator Williams and his wife, the Chens, the Portlands. We can add one more person, Victoria. It's not about adding one more person, it's about..." She stopped, carefully placing a lily in the vase. "Never mind. Of course Grace should be there. She's family." The word family came out strangled, like it hurt her throat. Thomas studied his wife, really looked at her for the first time in weeks. There was something brittle about her lately, something sharp beneath the polished surface. "What's really bothering you?" "Nothing's bothering me. You've been different, distant." Victoria laughed, but it sounded hollow. "I've been distant, Thomas. You've spent every spare moment with that girl for the past month. You barely come home before midnight. When was the last time we had dinner together? Just the two of us. Her name is Grace, and she's my daughter. So you keep saying..." Victoria's mask slipped for just a second, revealing something ugly underneath. "But what do you really know about her? Where she's been? What she's done? What are you implying?" "I'm not implying anything. I'm simply saying that DNA tests don't tell you about a person's character. She could be..." "Stop!" Thomas's voice was hard. "I won't listen to this. Grace is innocent in all of this. She didn't ask for any of it. Neither did I." Victoria slammed the vase down, water sloshing onto the antique table. "I've been your wife for 20 years, Thomas. 20 years of supporting you, standing by you, helping you build this life. And now some stranger appears and suddenly I'm the villain." "You're not the villain. But you're not being fair either. Fair. Victoria's laugh was brittle. You want to talk about fair? Try watching your husband fall in love with someone else right in front of you. She's my daughter. She's a ghost of Laura that you can't let go of. Victoria's composure was cracking, her voice rising. You look at that girl and you see your dead wife, and you think somehow, magically, you can get back what you lost. But you can't, Thomas. Laura is gone. She's been gone for 23 years. The silence that followed was deafening. I think you should leave, Thomas said quietly. Go stay at the apartment downtown for a few days. We both need space. Victoria's face went white. You're kicking me out. Of my own home. It's not forever. Just until we can both think clearly. This is because of her. This is because of us. We've been broken for a long time, Victoria. I just didn't want to see it. Victoria stared at him for a long moment, and Thomas saw something flash across her face. Panic, calculation, rage, all cycling through in seconds. Then the mask slammed back into place. Fine, I'll go. But Thomas... She picked up her purse, her hands shaking slightly. When you realize what a mistake you're making, don't expect me to be waiting. She left without another word, heels clicking sharply across the marble floor. Thomas stood alone in the dining room, surrounded by expensive furniture and fresh flowers, and felt nothing but relief. Grace was closing up the cafe when her phone rang. Thomas's name flashed on the screen. Hey, she answered, wiping down the counter. Everything okay? Victoria and I had a fight, a big one. Thomas sounded exhausted. I asked her to stay somewhere else for a few days. Grace's stomach dropped. Because of me, because of us, our marriage has been over for a long time. I just didn't want to admit it. He paused. Grace, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be honest. Do you think I'm making a mistake? Letting you into my life? Pushing Victoria away? I don't know, Grace said truthfully. Maybe you should talk to a therapist or something. Get perspective from someone who isn't me. That's exactly what Laura would have said. Thomas's voice was warm, always thinking of others first. Look, I know this is messy and complicated, but I don't regret finding you. Whatever happens with Victoria, that's not your fault. Our problems existed long before you came along. After they hung up, Grace sat in the empty cafe for a long time. Through the window, she could see commuters rushing past, everyone absorbed in their own worlds, their own dramas. She thought about Victoria's face at that dinner, the cold calculation behind her eyes, about the rumors that had started spreading through Seattle's social circles, about the way Victoria's entire past seemed to evaporate the further back Grace tried to trace it. Something was very wrong. She could feel it in her bones. Victoria drove to a hotel in downtown Seattle, her mind racing. Everything was falling apart faster than she could control it. Thomas was slipping away. Grace was digging into her past. Victoria's sources had confirmed the girl had been asking questions, searching records, and Carol Vickers was still alive. She called Robert Chen from the hotel room. Tell me you've handled the Carol situation. I'm working on it. But Victoria, you need to understand. If we do anything to this woman, and it gets traced back to you, Thomas will know. The optics. I don't care about optics. I care about protecting what's mine. Then maybe it's time to cut your losses, take a divorce settlement and... No. Victoria's voice was ice. I didn't spend 23 years building this life to walk away with nothing. Find another way to discredit Grace. There has to be something in her past we can use. She's lived a pretty clean life, actually. No arrests, no scandals. Everyone has secrets. Find hers. After she hung up, Victoria poured herself a vodka from the minibar and stood at the window, looking out at the city lights. Somewhere out there, Grace was probably feeling victorious, thinking she'd won. But Victoria hadn't survived this long by giving up easily. The next morning, Thomas was having coffee in his study when something occurred to him. Victoria's comment about the hospital, weeks ago during an earlier argument. She'd mentioned specific details, things he'd never discussed with her. He pulled out his laptop and started searching through old emails, old files. He found the police report from the night his daughter disappeared. He'd read it 1,000 times, memorized every word. The baby was discovered missing at 2:47 a.m. The nurse on duty was wearing a light blue uniform with white stripes on the sleeves. West Wing, 3rd floor, Those details had never been released publicly. The police had kept them confidential to help weed out false leads and hoaxes. So how did Victoria know them? Thomas's hands started shaking. He tried to remember that conversation, tried to recall exactly what she'd said. She'd been defending herself, getting emotional, and the words had just slipped out. The nurse in the blue uniform with the white stripes didn't see anything unusual. She'd said it so casually, like it was common knowledge, but it wasn't. Thomas picked up his phone and called a number he hadn't used in years. Paul Morrison, the private investigator who'd worked his daughter's case 23 years ago. Mr. Davenport, Paul sounded surprised. I heard you found her. Congratulations. I need you to do something for me. I need you to investigate my wife. There was a long pause. Your wife, Thomas. Are you sure? I'm sure. Her background, her credentials, everything. Go back as far as you can. I want to know who Victoria Lane really is. All right, but Thomas, if I find something you don't want to know, find it anyway. Grace was stocking napkins when Danny approached her, looking uncomfortable. Hey, there's a lady here asking about you. Says she's a reporter. Grace's heart sank. What does she want? Something about your past. She's asking if you had any run-ins with the law, any financial problems. I told her to leave, but she's persistent. Grace found the reporter, a sharp-looking woman in her 30s, waiting by the counter. Ms. Miller, I'm Jennifer Wong from the Seattle Tribune. I'm doing a piece on your story, and I just had a few questions. I'm not interested in talking to reporters. I understand, but some questions have been raised about the circumstances of your reunion with Mr. Davenport. There are people suggesting you might have manipulated. I didn't manipulate anything. The DNA test was done by an independent lab. Everything's legitimate. Of course, but you have to admit, the timing is convenient. A struggling waitress suddenly discovers she's heir to $1 billion fortune. This interview is over. Grace turned to walk away, but Jennifer's next words stopped her cold. What about your time at St. Anne's? Did you know that the orphanage received a substantial anonymous donation around the time you were found there? Someone paid a lot of money to make sure you were taken in. No questions asked. Grace spun around. What are you talking about? Records show a $50,000 donation to St. Anne's, made the day after you were abandoned there. The donor was anonymous, but the timing is interesting, don't you think? Almost like someone wanted to make sure you were taken care of or hidden. After Jennifer left, Grace stood frozen, her mind reeling. $50,000 23 years ago, someone had made sure she ended up at St. Anne's, made sure she was cared for, but who and why? She pulled out her phone and called Thomas. We need to talk. Something's wrong. Something's been wrong from the beginning. I know, Thomas said, his voice grim. I'm starting to figure that out too. Paul Morrison called Thomas 3 days later. You're going to want to sit down for this. Thomas was in his study, the door locked, curtains drawn. Grace sat across from him, having driven over as soon as he'd texted her. They'd spent the last 72 hours comparing notes, piecing together fragments that didn't quite fit. I'm sitting. Tell me, Victoria Lane didn't exist before she met you. I mean that literally. The woman you married. Her entire identity was constructed around 25 years ago. Paul's voice was grim. Her occupational therapy credentials are fake. The clinics she claimed to work at. 2 of them never existed. The third had a fire that destroyed all their records. Conveniently, about 6 months after she stopped working there. Grace watched the color drain from Thomas's face. But here's where it gets interesting, Paul continued. I found a Victoria Lang, no E at the end, who worked as a nurse at St. Andrew's Hospital. Same age, same physical description. She was on staff there the night your daughter disappeared. Thomas's hand tightened on the phone. You're sure? I tracked down former employees, got copies of old staff photos. Thomas, it's her. Your wife was working at the hospital the night your baby was taken. The room seemed to tilt. Grace reached for Thomas's hand, finding it ice cold. There's more, Paul said. I pulled financial records. 2 weeks after your daughter's disappearance, Victoria Lang made a cash deposit of $50,000. Then she quit her job and disappeared for 2 years. When she resurfaced, she was Victoria Lane with a completely new identity. The donation to St. Anne's? Grace whispered. That reporter said someone gave them $50,000 the day after I was found. I'm already tracking that down, Paul said, having heard Grace's voice through the speaker. Give me another day, but Thomas, you need to be careful. If Victoria realizes you're investigating her, find me everything, Thomas said, his voice hard. I don't care what it costs. I want to know every single thing she's done. After he hung up, Thomas sat very still for a long moment. When he finally looked at Grace, his eyes were red. She knew, he said. Victoria knew where you were this whole time. She might have even... His voice broke. Oh God, Grace. What if she's the one who took you? Paul worked fast. By the next evening, he'd assembled a file that made Grace's stomach turn. They met at a lawyer's office. Neutral ground, away from prying eyes. Paul spread documents across the conference table like evidence at a crime scene. Carol Vickers, he said, pointing to a photograph of an older woman with gray hair and a worn face. She was the head nurse in the maternity ward at St. Andrews. She quit the same day Victoria did. I tracked her down to a nursing home in Tacoma. Advanced liver disease. She's not doing well. Is she willing to talk? Thomas asked. She's terrified, but she's also dying, and I think she wants to clear her conscience. Paul pulled out a bank statement. 23 years ago, Carol Vickers received a wire transfer of $50,000 from an offshore account. The same day, Victoria Lang made a $50,000 withdrawal from her savings. Victoria paid her, Grace said, the pieces clicking into place with horrible clarity. She paid Carol to help her take me. That's what it looks like. I've got a videographer standing by. If Carol's willing to give a deathbed confession, we need it recorded and witnessed. Thomas stood abruptly, pacing to the window. I married her. I shared my life with her for 20 years. How did I not see? She's a skilled manipulator, Paul said quietly. She studied you, learned what you needed, became that person. You were grieving, vulnerable. She took advantage of that. Grace felt rage building in her chest. Hot and fierce, this woman, this monster, had stolen her entire life, had orchestrated her mother's death, her abandonment, 23 years of separation from her father, all for money, for status. I want to go with you, Grace said, to talk to Carol. I don't think that's a good idea. I deserve to hear this. I need to hear it from her. Thomas turned from the window, his jaw set. We both do. The Evergreen Care Facility in Tacoma smelled like antiseptic and old age. Carol Vickers was in room 237, hooked up to machines that beeped softly in the sterile air. She looked smaller than her photograph, diminished by illness and time. Her eyes were closed when they entered, but they fluttered open at the sound of footsteps. When she saw Thomas, she started crying. I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice raspy and weak. I'm so sorry. Thomas pulled up a chair next to the bed, Grace standing behind him, Paul setting up the camera discreetly in the corner. Tell me what happened, Thomas said. Please, I need to know. Carol's hands shook as she reached for a cup of water. Grace helped her drink, then stepped back. Victoria came to me about a week before your wife gave birth, Carol began, words coming slowly. She said she had a proposition. $50,000 if I helped her. If I helped her take your baby. Grace's nails dug into her palms. She knew Laura was high risk, knew there was a good chance she wouldn't survive the delivery, Victoria said. Carol's voice broke. She said if the baby disappeared, you'd eventually move on, that you'd need someone to help you heal. She planned it all so carefully. How? Thomas's voice was barely controlled. The night of the delivery, I was on duty. When Laura died and the baby was taken to the nursery, I waited until the shift change, 2:47 a.m. I was wearing my regular uniform, light blue scrubs with white stripes on the sleeves. I took the baby through the West Wing service entrance. No cameras there. We'd made sure they were malfunctioning. Where did you take her? Grace asked, her voice shaking. Carol looked at her, really looked at her, and fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. You. Oh God. You're her. You're the baby. Where did you take me? To Victoria. She was waiting in the parking lot. She drove you to St. Anne's orphanage and left you on the doorstep. She gave them $50,000 to take you in. No questions asked. Then she went back and altered all the hospital records, erased security footage, made it look like you'd been taken by traffickers. Thomas made a sound like he'd been punched. We spread rumors that the baby was taken out of state. Victoria made sure every investigation led to dead ends. Then she disappeared, changed her name, built a new identity. 2 years later, she came back as Victoria Lane and seduced you. Carol was sobbing now, her fragile body shaking. I'm sorry. I needed the money. I had debts, terrible debts. But that's no excuse. I helped her destroy your family. I've lived with that guilt every single day. Did Victoria know what happened to the baby? Grace asked. Did she know I ended up at St. Anne's? She checked, made sure you were placed and cared for. She didn't want you dead, just gone, hidden where Thomas would never find you. Carol reached out with a trembling hand. I kept track of you over the years, made sure you were okay. It was the least I could do. Paul stepped forward with documents. Mrs. Vickers, I need you to sign this statement confirming everything you just told us, and we have it all on video. Carol signed with shaking hands. Will I go to prison? You're dying, Thomas said flatly. Prison isn't the punishment you need to worry about. They left the nursing home in silence. Grace felt numb, like her body was moving on autopilot while her mind struggled to process what she'd heard. Victoria had orchestrated everything, had planned it with cold precision, had stolen Grace's entire life, and then spent 20 years pretending to love the man she'd destroyed. What do we do now? Grace asked as they reached Thomas's car. Thomas's face was carved from stone. Now we make sure she pays for what she's done. He pulled out his phone and made a call. Detective Rodriguez, this is Thomas Davenport. I need to report a crime, a kidnapping, 23 years ago. Victoria was having lunch at an expensive restaurant downtown when her phone rang. Robert Chen's name flashed on the screen. What? She snapped, irritated at the interruption. Victoria, you need to leave now. Thomas knows everything. Carol Vickers gave a full confession. The police are probably on their way to arrest you. The fork slipped from Victoria's fingers, clattering against her plate around her. Other diners continued their meals, oblivious to her world imploding. That's impossible. Carol wouldn't. She's dying, and she wanted to clear her conscience. It's over, Victoria. You need to run. Victoria stood abruptly. Throwing cash on the table, her mind raced through options. She had accounts overseas, passports under different names, contingency plans she'd maintained for years because some part of her had always known this day might come. She could disappear, start over somewhere else. She'd done it before. Book me a flight, she told Robert. Tonight to Spain, first class. Use the alternate passport. Victoria, running makes you look guilty. I am guilty. She was practically running to her car now, heels clicking frantically on the pavement. Just do it. She drove to the mansion, threw clothes into suitcases, grabbed jewelry and cash from the safe. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely zip the bags. 20 years. 20 years of careful planning, of playing the perfect wife, of maintaining the facade, all destroyed because of a dying woman's conscience and Thomas's suspicious mind. She should have killed Carol years ago when she had the chance. As Victoria headed for the airport, her phone buzzed with a text from Thomas. I know what you did. All of it. The police are waiting. You can't run from this. Victoria threw the phone out the window and pressed harder on the accelerator. Seattle-Tacoma International Airport was crowded with evening travelers when Victoria's Mercedes screeched into the parking garage. She grabbed her 2 hastily packed suitcases and practically ran toward the terminal, her designer heels clicking urgently against the concrete. Her flight to Madrid left in 90 minutes. She just needed to get through security, board the plane, and disappear into Europe. She'd done it before. She could do it again. But as she approached the international departures entrance, she saw them. 2 police officers, standing near the check-in counter, eyes scanning the crowd. One of them held a photograph, probably her photograph. Victoria's heart hammered against her ribs. She turned sharply, heading toward the restrooms, mind racing. There had to be another way. A different terminal, a private charter, something. Mrs. Davenport. She froze. Detective Maria Rodriguez stood behind her, flanked by 2 uniformed officers. I'm going to need you to come with me, the detective said calmly. We have some questions about events that occurred 23 years ago. I don't know what you're talking about. Victoria's voice was steady, despite the panic clawing at her chest. I'm late for a flight. To Madrid. Yes, we know, under the name Victoria Merchant. using a passport that we're pretty sure is fraudulent. Detective Rodriguez gestured toward a private security office. We can do this here, quietly, or we can do it in front of all these people. Your choice. Victoria glanced around. Travelers were already starting to stare, phones coming out. If this turned into a scene, if videos ended up online, she walked toward the office, head held high, refusing to look defeated even as her world crumbled. Thomas and Grace arrived at the airport 20 minutes later. Paul had called ahead, coordinating with Detective Rodriguez to make sure Victoria didn't slip away. They were led to a VIP lounge where Victoria sat in a chair, her wrists already in handcuffs. 2 officers standing guard. When she saw Thomas, something flickered across her face. Desperation, calculation, and finally, rage. Thomas, thank God you're here. This is all a terrible misunderstanding. Save it. Thomas's voice was ice. I know everything, Carol confessed. We have it on video. Victoria's mask slipped for just a second before sliding back into place. Carol is a dying woman with liver disease. Her mind is gone. Whatever she told you. She told us about the $50,000, Grace said, stepping forward. About the blue scrubs with white stripes. About the West Wing service entrance at 2:47 in the morning. Victoria's eyes darted to Grace, and for the first time, there was genuine fear there. You can't prove anything. We have bank records, Paul said, entering the room with a thick folder. Wire transfers from you to Carol, the donation to St. Anne's, your employment records at the hospital. Under the name Victoria Lang, your completely fabricated identity as Victoria Lane. He dropped the folder on the table with a satisfying thud. We can prove all of it. Victoria stood abruptly, chains rattling. I want my lawyer. Robert Chen already declined to represent you, Detective Rodriguez said. Apparently, he doesn't want to be associated with a kidnapping case, but you're welcome to find someone else. Grace stepped closer, looking Victoria directly in the eyes. Why did you do it? I was just a baby. I never did anything to you. You were in my way. The words came out flat, emotionless. Victoria's careful facade was finally cracking. Thomas was supposed to be mine. I'd planned it so carefully. But as long as you existed, he'd never let go of Laura. He'd never move on. So you stole her. Thomas's voice shook with barely controlled rage. You stole my daughter, and let me believe she was dead or trafficked. Do you have any idea what that did to me? The years I spent searching, the guilt. Oh, please. Victoria laughed bitterly. You got over it. You married me, didn't you? Built a new life. You were happy? I was never happy, Thomas said quietly. I was just surviving, and you took advantage of that. You studied me like a predator studies prey, figured out exactly what I needed, and became that person. I loved you. Victoria's composure shattered. Everything I did because I loved you. I gave you 20 years. You gave me 20 years of lies, Thomas roared. You built our entire marriage on the grave of my daughter, and you convinced me it was real, that we were real. We were real, Victoria said desperately. Thomas, think about what we had, the life we built together. That was real. My feelings were real. Your feelings, Grace's voice was sharp. You destroyed my family before I was even a day old. You stole my mother, my father, my entire life. Because of you, I grew up in an orphanage. I never knew what it was like to have a parent, to have a home. And you're talking about your feelings. Victoria looked at Grace with something like contempt. You turned out fine. You were fed, clothed, educated. By nuns, by strangers, not by my father who loved me and spent 23 years searching. Grace's hands were shaking. You took that from both of us. And for what? Money? Status? For everything, Victoria screamed. Do you know what it's like to have nothing? To watch wealthy people come through that hospital every day, knowing you'll never have what they have. I was drowning in debt, working double shifts, and barely surviving. Thomas was my chance, my one chance to have the life I deserved. You didn't deserve anything, Thomas said coldly. You're a thief and a liar and a kidnapper, and I hope you rot in prison for what you've done. Victoria lunged forward, chains rattling, but the officers held her back. Her face was twisted with rage and desperation. "You're going to regret this." "Both of you. She's not Laura, Thomas. She'll never be Laura. You're chasing a ghost. And when you finally realize that, I'll be gone, and you'll have nothing." "I'll have my daughter," Thomas said. "That's more than I've had in 23 years. More than you ever gave me." Detective Rodriguez stepped forward. "Mrs. Davenport, you're under arrest for kidnapping, conspiracy, falsification of documents, and fraud. You have the right to remain silent." But Victoria wasn't listening. Her eyes were fixed on Thomas, wild and desperate. "Wait. Please, just wait." Her voice broke. "Thomas, I know I did terrible things, but we can fix this. We can work through it. 20 years has to count for something, please." Thomas looked at her for a long moment when he finally spoke. His voice was gentle but final. "The woman I married doesn't exist. She never did. You were always just Victoria Lang, the nurse who stole my baby. Everything else was a lie." "Thomas..." "Goodbye, Victoria." He turned and walked out, Grace following close behind. Behind them, Victoria screamed, rage and despair, and the sound of a woman who'd finally lost everything. In the airport corridor, Grace and Thomas stood together, neither speaking for a long moment. "Are you okay?" Grace finally asked. "No." Thomas looked 10 years older than he had that morning. "But I will be, eventually. She said she loved you. Do you think any part of that was true?" Thomas considered this. Maybe she convinced herself it was true. Maybe after 20 years of playing a role, she forgot where the act ended and reality began. But it doesn't matter. Whatever she felt, it wasn't love. Love doesn't destroy people. Grace slipped her hand into his. "What happens now? Now, the prosecutors take over. There'll be a trial, media coverage, all of it. It's going to be hard." He squeezed her hand. "But we'll face it together, as father and daughter, the way it should have been from the beginning." In the security office, Victoria sat alone, mascara running down her face, hands trembling in the cuffs. Everything she'd built, everything she'd sacrificed for, was gone. But even now, even facing prison and ruin, she couldn't bring herself to feel genuine remorse. She felt angry at Carol for talking, at Thomas for investigating, at Grace for existing. In Victoria's mind, she was the victim. She'd only done what was necessary to survive in a world that gave nothing to people like her. If she could go back and do it all again, knowing how it would end, would she choose differently? Victoria stared at her reflection in the window, at the stranger looking back at her, the real her, finally exposed after 20 years of masks. No, she wouldn't change a thing. And that, perhaps, was the most damning truth of all. Outside the airport, the Seattle rain had started again, washing the city clean. Thomas and Grace stood under an awning, watching planes take off into the dark sky. "She could have been on one of those," Grace said quietly, "if we'd been an hour later, but we weren't. She's not going anywhere." Thomas put his arm around his daughter's shoulders. "It's over, Grace. She can't hurt us anymore." But even as he said it, both of them knew that wasn't quite true. The damage Victoria had done would take years to heal. The scars would always be there. Still, standing together in the rain, they had something Victoria could never take away. Each other, and the truth, finally brought to light. The trial lasted 6 weeks and dominated every news cycle in Seattle. Camera crews camped outside the courthouse. Reporters dissected every detail of Victoria's elaborate deception. Grace's face appeared on magazine covers with headlines like "The Lost Heiress" and "23 Years of Lies." Grace hated every minute of it. She sat in the courtroom day after day, listening to prosecutors lay out Victoria's crimes with clinical precision. Bank records, testimony from former hospital employees, Carol Vickers's videotaped confession, played for the jury on a large screen while Victoria sat stone-faced at the defense table. Carol had died 2 weeks after giving her statement, slipping away peacefully in her sleep. Sister Margaret said it was probably a relief, that carrying such a terrible secret for so long had been its own kind of prison. The defense tried to paint Victoria as a woman driven to desperate measures by poverty and mental illness. They brought in psychiatrists who talked about personality disorders and childhood trauma. They suggested that Victoria had convinced herself she was acting in Thomas's best interest, that she'd rationalized her actions as a form of mercy. but the prosecution had one piece of evidence that destroyed any sympathy. A safe deposit box Victoria had maintained under her false identity, containing detailed notes and newspaper clippings about Grace's life at the orphanage. Victoria had tracked her for years, watching from a distance to ensure she stayed hidden. It wasn't the act of someone who'd made a desperate mistake. It was the work of someone who'd planned everything carefully and monitored the results. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours, guilty on all counts. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for a Friday morning. Grace almost didn't go. She'd had enough of courtrooms and cameras and the constant rehashing of her stolen childhood. But Thomas convinced her. "You need to see this through," he said. "For closure. For both of us." So they sat in the front row as Victoria was led in, wearing a plain orange jumpsuit instead of her usual designer clothes. She looked smaller somehow. Diminished, her hair had lost its perfect styling. Her face was bare of makeup. Judge Patricia Hoffman reviewed the charges methodically. Kidnapping, conspiracy, falsification of documents, identity fraud. The list went on. Mrs. Davenport, or should I say, Mrs. Lang, what you did was not merely criminal. It was an act of profound cruelty that destroyed multiple lives for your own selfish gain. Judge Hoffman's voice was stern. You stole a child from her father, fabricated an entirely false identity, and spent 20 years deceiving a man who trusted you. The emotional and psychological damage you've caused is immeasurable. Victoria stood perfectly still, showing no emotion. Do you have anything to say before I impose sentence? For a long moment, Victoria was silent. Then she turned and looked directly at Thomas and Grace. I'm not sorry, she said clearly. I did what I had to do to survive in a world that gave me nothing. Maybe that makes me a monster in your eyes. But I gave Thomas 20 years of companionship. I made him happy when he was broken. That has to count for something. Grace felt Thomas tense beside her, but he said nothing. You gave him nothing, Grace found herself saying, standing up. You gave him lies wrapped in pretty packaging. Every moment he shared with you was built on my mother's grave and my stolen childhood. That's not love. That's not companionship. That's parasitic. Victoria's eyes flashed with anger, but she didn't respond. Judge Hoffman brought down her gavel. Victoria Lang, I hereby sentence you to 25 years in federal prison without possibility of parole. In addition, you are ordered to pay full restitution to Mr. Davenport and Mrs. Miller for damages. Court is adjourned. As the bailiffs led Victoria away, she looked back one more time, not at Thomas, but at Grace. And in that look was something Grace couldn't quite read. Rage, regret, defiance, all mixed together. Then she was gone. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed like locusts. Thomas and Grace pushed through to their waiting car, declining to make statements. They'd agreed beforehand. No interviews, no triumphant declarations. This wasn't a victory. It was just over. Paul Morrison drove them back to the mansion, the house that had been Victoria's domain for 20 years. Thomas had been staying there since her arrest, but Grace could see it was taking a toll. Every room held memories of lies. I'm selling it, Thomas said as they pulled up the driveway. I should have done it months ago. This place feels poisoned. Where will you go? I don't know yet. Somewhere smaller. Somewhere without ghosts. He looked at Grace. Maybe you could help me pick something out. If you want to, no pressure. Grace smiled. Over the past months, she and Thomas had been slowly, carefully building something real between them. It wasn't the instant connection she'd dreamed of as a child. It was messier and more complicated than that. But it was genuine. I'd like that. They walked through the mansion one last time. Thomas showed Grace things she'd never seen. Laura's wedding dress, preserved in a garment bag in the attic. Photo albums Victoria hadn't managed to destroy, hidden in the back of a closet. A baby blanket Laura had knitted while pregnant, soft yellow with white trim. I didn't know these still existed, Thomas said, touching the blanket with trembling fingers. Victoria told me she'd donated everything to charity, but she must have just hidden it away. Grace wrapped the blanket around her shoulders. It still smelled faintly of lavender, even after all these years. What was she like, my mother? Thomas's eyes grew distant. She was kind, genuinely, deeply kind. She saw the best in people even when they didn't deserve it. She laughed easily. She was terrible at cooking but insisted on trying anyway. He smiled at the memory. She would have loved you so much, Grace. Not for who she wanted you to be, but for exactly who you are. I wish I could have known her. Me too. But you're a lot like her, you know. That same kindness, that same strength. Thomas pulled Grace into a hug. She would be so proud of you. I'm proud of you. Grace let herself cry then. For the mother she'd never known. For the years she'd lost. For the pain that Victoria's selfishness had caused. But also for this moment. For having her father's arms around her. For finally belonging somewhere. 2 weeks later, Carol Vickers was laid to rest in a quiet cemetery outside Tacoma. Only a handful of people attended. A few former co-workers, her estranged daughter, and surprisingly, Grace. Thomas had been shocked when Grace said she wanted to go. She helped kidnap you, he'd said. Why would you want to pay your respects? Because she told the truth in the end. She could have stayed silent and died with her secret, but she didn't. She gave us answers. Grace had looked at her father steadily. And because someone should be there, even people who do terrible things deserve to be mourned by someone. At the graveside, Grace placed a single white rose on the casket. Thank you for finally being brave enough to tell the truth, she whispered. I hope you've found peace. Carol's daughter approached afterward, eyes red from crying. I didn't know what my mother had done until the police told me. I'm so sorry for what she put you through. Your mother spent 23 years carrying that guilt, Grace said gently. That was its own kind of punishment. You don't need to apologize for her. Still, thank you for coming. It means more than you know. As Grace walked back to where Thomas waited by the car, she felt something shift inside her. The anger she'd been carrying, the rage at what had been stolen from her felt lighter somehow. Not gone, but manageable. How do you feel? Thomas asked. Free, Grace said, and realized it was true. For the first time in months, I actually feel free. That evening, they visited Sister Margaret at St. Anne's. The old nun had followed the trial closely, praying daily for everyone involved, even Victoria. Justice has been served, Sister Margaret said, pouring tea in her small office. But justice isn't the same as healing, child. How is your heart? Getting there, Grace said honestly. Some days are harder than others, but I have Dad now, and you, and that's more than I ever thought I'd have. Thomas had donated a substantial sum to St. Anne's, funding renovations and establishing a scholarship fund in Laura's name. The building that had once been Grace's entire world was being transformed, made beautiful and safe for the next generation of children who needed it. Laura would have loved this, Sister Margaret said, looking at the architectural plans spread across her desk. She always wanted to help children. That's what you told me. Thomas? She did. She volunteered at a children's hospital before we got married. Said every child deserved to feel loved and protected. Thomas glanced at Grace. She would have been the most amazing mother. She still is, Sister Margaret said firmly. Through grace, love doesn't die, Thomas. It just changes form. Laura's love lives in this girl, in her kindness and strength. That's a mother's greatest legacy. Grace felt tears prick her eyes, but they were good tears this time, healing tears. Later that night, Grace stood in her small apartment, packing. Thomas had found a house. Nothing like the mansion, but a warm, comfortable place in a quiet neighborhood. It had 4 bedrooms, a real kitchen, and a yard with a garden. 1 room for me, 1 for you if you want it, 1 for guests, and 1 for whatever you need. Art studio, home office, whatever, Thomas had said when showing her the listing. What do you think? Grace had said yes immediately. Now, as she folded her clothes and wrapped her few possessions, she realized this was it. The life she'd dreamed of as a 5-year-old drawing pictures at St. Anne's Dad and me together. Her phone buzzed with a text from Thomas. Pizza tonight. I'm a terrible cook, remember? Grace smiled and typed back. Perfect. See you soon, Dad. She looked around the tiny apartment one last time, at the life she was leaving behind. It hadn't been much, but it had been hers. And now she was choosing something more. Not because she had to, but because she wanted to. That made all the difference. 1 year later, the early morning light filtered through the kitchen windows of the house on Maple Street, catching the steam rising from 2 coffee mugs on the counter. Grace stood barefoot on the hardwood floor, watching her father attempt to make pancakes. "I think you're supposed to flip them before they turn black," she said, trying not to laugh. Thomas scraped at the pan with a spatula, frowning. "Your mother was the cook in our marriage. I handled the business deals. She handled making sure we didn't starve." "Well, we're not starving." Grace took the spatula from him gently. "But we might want to order backup breakfast just in case." They'd fallen into this routine over the past year. Easy mornings, terrible cooking attempts. Laughter that came more naturally now. The house wasn't fancy like the mansion had been, but it felt like home in a way that place never had. Grace's artwork hung on the walls. She'd discovered a talent for painting during therapy sessions. Thomas's books lined the shelves, actually read, instead of just displayed for show. This was real. This was theirs. "Big day today," Thomas said, pouring orange juice. "You nervous?" "Terrified," Grace admitted. She was starting nursing school at the University of Washington in 2 weeks. But today was the opening ceremony for the Laura and Grace Davenport Foundation. They'd spent months planning it. A comprehensive organization dedicated to helping find missing children and supporting orphanages across the state. St. Anne's had been their first project. The old building had been completely renovated. New playground equipment, updated classrooms, a proper library. Sister Margaret had cried when she saw it. "Your mother would be so proud," Thomas said, reading Grace's thoughts. "Both of what we've built and who you've become." Grace smiled. "I think she'd be proud of you too. You could have let bitterness destroy you after everything that happened, but you didn't." "I had a reason not to." Thomas reached across the breakfast bar and squeezed her hand. "I got my daughter back. That's worth more than any revenge or anger." The foundation's headquarters was housed in a restored building downtown, with large windows that let in natural light and walls painted in warm, welcoming colors. By 10 o'clock, the lobby was packed with reporters, donors, and community members who'd come for the ribbon-cutting ceremony. Grace spotted familiar faces in the crowd. Danny from the Riverside Café, her old roommates Melissa and Sarah, several nuns from St. Anne's. Paul Morrison stood near the back, giving her an encouraging thumbs up. And there, in the front row, was Sister Margaret. Dressed in her best habit, beaming with pride, the mayor gave a speech about community and compassion. Thomas spoke about the importance of never giving up hope, even in the darkest times. Then it was Grace's turn. She stepped up to the microphone, her hands shaking slightly. Public speaking still terrified her, but she'd learned to push through the fear. "A year ago, I was serving coffee to strangers who never saw my face," she began, her voice steady despite her nerves. "I had no idea who I was or where I came from. I had dreams, sure, dreams of finding my family, of belonging somewhere, but they seemed impossible. Just fantasies I drew with crayons when I was 5 years old." She paused, looking at Thomas. "And then one morning, my father walked into that cafe and everything changed. Not just because I found out who I was, but because I learned what family really means. It's not just DNA or shared history. It's choosing to love someone, choosing to fight for them, choosing to build something real together." Grace's eyes found Sister Margaret. "I had family all along at St. Anne's. Sister Margaret loved me when I had no one else. She gave me hope. Literally. She kept my bracelet safe, treasured my childish drawings, and taught me that I was worthy of love, even when I couldn't see it myself." The old nun dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. "This foundation exists because there are thousands of children out there like I was, lost, searching, hoping. And there are thousands of parents like my father, who never stop looking, who never stop loving. We can't fix everything. We can't undo the damage that people like Victoria cause, but we can make sure that hope survives. We can make sure that families like mine have a chance to find each other." The applause was thunderous. Grace stepped back from the microphone, her heart pounding, and found herself wrapped in Thomas's embrace. "Your mother would have been so incredibly proud," he whispered, "and so am I." After the ceremony, they decided to do something they'd been planning for weeks: visit the Riverside Café one more time. The cafe hadn't changed much. Same worn counter, same perpetual smell of coffee and pastries, same rush of commuters hurrying to catch trains. But when Grace and Thomas walked through the door, everyone stopped. Danny dropped the espresso portafilter he was holding. "Grace, Mr. Davenport, oh my God." Within seconds, Grace was surrounded by her former coworkers, all talking at once. They'd followed her story in the news, seen the trial coverage, cheered when Victoria was convicted. "We saved your drawing, Marco," the owner said, gesturing to the wall behind the counter. There it was, still in its frame. Dad and me, Grace, 5 years old. Grace felt tears prick her eyes. "You kept it all this time." "Are you kidding? That thing's famous now. People come in just to see it." Marco grinned. "Though I gotta admit, it was way more special before we knew the whole story. Just a kid's dream on the wall." "It still is," Grace said softly. "It's just that now, the dream came true." Thomas stood in front of the drawing for a long time, studying the crude crayon figures holding hands. "I remember the day Laura and I talked about baby names," he said quietly. "She wanted something that meant hope or new beginnings. We'd settled on hope, actually. But then the bracelet came with that word already on it, so we were going to choose something else." He turned to Grace. "I like that you're Grace. It fits you perfectly. But in a way, you've always been hope too." Grace touched the silver bracelet at her neck, the one that had survived everything, that had brought them together, the imperfect H that looked like a tiny heart. "Can we take a picture?" Danny asked, holding up his phone. "For the wall. Grace the waitress who became Grace the philanthropist." They posed in front of the drawing. Grace and Thomas, father and daughter, standing where it had all begun in the photo. They're both smiling. Thomas's arm around Grace's shoulders, her hand resting over his heart. That photograph would hang in the Riverside Café for years to come, a reminder that miracles could happen in the most ordinary places. As the sun began to set, painting Seattle's skyline in shades of orange and pink, Grace and Thomas walked through the city, no destination in mind, just enjoying the evening in each other's company. "What do you think happens to Victoria now?" Grace asked. It was a question she'd avoided for months, but lately she'd been thinking about it more. She serves her sentence. Maybe she uses that time to become a better person. Maybe she doesn't. Thomas shrugged. "Either way, she's not our problem anymore. We can't spend the rest of our lives defined by what she did. Do you ever miss her? The person you thought she was?" Thomas considered this carefully. "Sometimes I miss the illusion, the comfort of thinking I had a partner who loved me, but that person never existed, so I'm not really missing anything real." He looked at Grace. "I have you now. That's real. This is real. Everything else is just noise." They ended up at Cary Park, overlooking the city. From here, they could see everything. The Space Needle, the waterfront, the endless stretch of neighborhoods where millions of stories played out every day. "You know what's crazy?" Grace said, leaning against the railing. "If Victoria hadn't done what she did, I wouldn't be me. I'd have grown up completely different. Maybe I'd be spoiled and entitled. Maybe I'd take everything for granted. Or maybe you'd be exactly who you are now, just without the trauma." Thomas put his arm around her. "Don't give her credit for your strength, Grace. You built that yourself. You survived because of who you are, not because of what she did." Grace thought about this, about Sister Margaret and the other kids at St. Anne's, about Danny and her roommates, and all the people who'd shown her kindness when she had nothing. "I guess you're right. We're more than what happens to us." "Exactly. We're what we choose to do with what happens to us." As darkness fell over Seattle, they stayed there a while longer, father and daughter, watching the city lights blink on one by one. They'd lost so much. Years, memories, the chance to know Laura. But they'd found something too. Each other. A second chance. Hope. Finally, Thomas checked his watch. "Ready to head home." Home. Grace smiled at the word, at how natural it sounded now. "Yeah, let's go home, Dad." They walked back to the car, talking about ordinary things, grocery shopping, Grace's upcoming classes, whether they should finally get a dog. Simple conversations that meant everything because they were real and honest and built on truth. The journey from that morning in the Riverside Café to this moment had been painful and complicated, and sometimes overwhelming, but it had also been beautiful. It had brought them here, to this life they were building together, one honest moment at a time. Grace touched her bracelet one more time as they drove through the city. Hope. That's what it said. And for the first time in her life, she understood what it really meant. Hope wasn't just wishing for something better. It was believing that better was possible, even when everything suggested otherwise. It was her father spending 23 years searching. It was Sister Margaret keeping a child's drawing safe. It was Grace herself, surviving and building a life even when she had nothing. Hope was choosing to try again, even after betrayal and loss. Hope was love that refused to give up. As they pulled into the driveway of their home on Maple Street, Grace looked at her father and smiled. "Finally, we're together, Dad." Thomas's eyes filled with tears, but they were good tears, healing tears. "Finally," he whispered. "After all these years, we're finally home." And for the first time in 23 years, Thomas Davenport felt complete.